This afternoon's topic is on loss of control in flight. Just a brief outline of what we'll be talking about, BJ and I will be talking about this afternoon, is first of all, we're going to try to convince you why it is an important topic. We're going to give you some evidence, some statistical evidence, and then we're going to go on to why has this become a problem, or why is it a problem in all aspects of aviation. And then we're going to say why, from a cognitive and from a flying standpoint, do pilots lose control. And probably most importantly, we're going to discuss what can be done for this potential problem. And we're going to give you some examples of what has been done, what is being done, and what can be done. And the bottom line becomes, once we present this evidence, why not you? Okay. So I would like to bring BJ up. We'll be teaching this together, and BJ's going to give a definition of really what is loss of control in flight.
Thanks, Janine. An important topic in loss of control is really understanding what it is. Often there's confusion between what an airplane upset is and what loss of control is, and in fact, one can lead to the other, but they don't necessarily have to follow each other. And one definition that we have here is that flight occurs outside the normal flight envelope with an inability of the pilot to control the airplane. So I think what we want to talk about, what is meant by a normal flight envelope, and when we say inability of the pilot to control the airplane, doesn't necessarily mean the airplane isn't responding to their inputs. It's the inability of the pilot to properly stop the flight path divergence. In other words, to get the airplane to do what he wants it to do as the end result. So let's talk about the envelope. So how do we define it? Well, one definition by the Airplane Upset Recovery Training Aid, even though there's a variety of them, and for commercial pilots can be as little as 45 degrees of bank and a pitch of 25 degrees nose up and 10 degrees nose down. Now, this can vary based on experience, the type of airplane you're flying, and the type of background that you have. But at the end of the day, what is a parameter set that you can have as a pilot where you need to realize whatever you were doing before doesn't matter, and now you have to regain control of the airplane? Now, that's just one aspect. That's pitch and bank. And there's another one, is in this same definition, it says, or within these parameters, but flying at airspeeds inappropriate for the flight conditions. And that's kind of a broad statement. And a little bit later, I'm going to get into some graphical analysis of what this implication is. But to show you these two statements graphically is that we take a look at the pitch and bank of an airplane. We can see that it's a tiny window of about 45 degrees of bank, 25 nose up, 10 degrees down. And in the envelope, that normal lift curve. I want you to remember that diagram because I'm going to be coming back to talk about it. The X that I put on there is typically the indication that pilots have to realize they're starting to get themselves into trouble in relation to the flight envelope. And that can be represented by a shaker, a light, a horn, or whatever type of warning system the pilot might have. And what we're going to do is come back and talk about this and hopefully give a better meaning as to what the risk factors are and what awareness a pilot can have to know that they're getting themselves into harm's way.
Some evidence. Why are we even talking about this topic? First of all, I want to give a little history. In 2005, I had the opportunity to talk here at Sun and Fun, and the title of the presentation in 2005 was losing control of a perfectly good airplane. And I am going to tell you right now, this is the same stuff, different day, 7 years later. As a matter of fact, the reason I even got interested in loss of control was in 1996 accident. When I lost 3 good friends in a DC-8 loss of control accident, they stalled the airplane and never recovered. So I got very, very interested in how in the world could that happen and started studying the whole situation. And the example high-profile accident report examples that I have on the slide here were from 2005. I just picked and chose a few of the examples, including the DC-8 accident. So when we were preparing for this year's presentation, I went back and I said, okay, well, let's take a look at some more high-profile accidents that have occurred where the probable cause was a loss of control in flight. Okay. So we've got high-profile accidents, and that's all well and good, and that may be what you read about in Flying Magazine and AOPA and your other publications. However, if we take a hard look at the statistics, at the real numbers. There's 3 points we need to make here, as not only who loses control, in that are they commercial pilots, corporate pilots, general aviation pilots, are they just U.S. pilots? And one of the points we want to make is we're not saying these are bad pilots. This can happen to any pilot at any certification level in any part of the world in any type of airplane. So when our title this year of who needs upset prevention and recovery training, UPRT, is it can be everyone. And we're going to come back to that a few more times as we talk. But on this slide, we show in the commercial aviation realm, Boeing publishes accidents on commercial airliners every year and has been for many, many years, that loss of control in flight is by far the leading, you can see on this slide, the leading problem on commercial aviation fatalities. If we include in that a failure of a system component or failure that's not the power plant, it can be any other system, that can also lead to a loss of control or maybe a contributing factor, or in the way we look at it, could be a precursor or the beginning of the chain of events that ended in loss of control. We certainly have many, many more accidents, fatal accidents and fatalities combining these two categories than all the rest of the categories combined. And one thing that surprises me, being a designated pilot examiner and having the opportunity to examine and test pilots on a daily basis, including flight instructors, is to go and ask them the question, just off the cuff, gee, what area or what types of accidents are the most prevalent in aviation? And it is not generally known. Just the topic, the awareness of the topic, can help start the ball rolling in preventing more and more loss of control accidents. So this is commercial aviation. Let's take a look at general aviation. The General Aviation Joint Steering Committee, Safety Analysis Team, that's all those acronyms, also found loss of control in flight to be the major problem. Okay? So this is general aviation. This is new data. Once again, we can look at the systems component or failure, the SCF, non-power plant. Icing and turbulence, precursors to loss of control. So we look at all of those categories together, and we say, gee, this is quite obvious, this is a problem. And BJ is going to talk a little bit later about how are we addressing that problem. Want to make a point that it's international. I just happened to choose Australia. These are some older data. However, same stuff in a different country. It's throughout the world. It's throughout every certification level. It is a problem in aviation. If you're thinking, well, of course this could not possibly pertain to me, I also pulled off some specific examples. Loss of control in flight. These are Australian. If you can look up here, you can look at there's an Airbus A340. There's a Robinson helicopter, R44. There's all kinds of different airplanes. Then I went back to the NTSB data, and what was quite interesting is I just looked at the last year. Wow, we've got a lot of different airplanes, a Beech A36, a MAL, a RANS S7, a Robinson helicopter. Oh, we have more just from the last year. These are accidents, loss of control accidents, just in the last year in the U.S. Well, not necessarily in the U.S., but investigated by the NTSB. So you might find your type of airplane or helicopter or flying machine on this list. Okay? And that's not to say these pilots were bad pilots that got themselves into this situation. However, somehow the chain of events evolved and got them into loss of control in flight situation. And just by comparison, what are the chances of the next accident being a loss of control in flight? Well, first of all, it's 3.5 times more likely to be loss of control in flight than a runway excursion, exiting the runway unintentionally. You may think of this as large airplane problems, but if you look at the data, you'll see how many times student pilots have a runway excursion, and oh, by the way, it's not usually on their first solo, it's generally on their second solo, when both the instructor and the student pilot have let their guard down, and all of a sudden they have a little bit of trouble on landing. We won't go into the whole discussion about perhaps they should be making full-stop taxibacks versus touch and goes, but 3.5 more times likely to be a loss of control in flight. How about a runway incursion where there's on the runway almost 10 times more likely the problem's going to be loss of control. One of the reasons we are showing these comparisons is there have been big efforts in runway incursions. The FAA has been very diligently trying to address runway incursions, but on the other hand, it's 10 times more likely that you're going to have a loss of control in flight problem. 1,861 times more likely than a fire, and this is one that I find very interesting. 788 times more likely you're going to have a loss of control in flight event than an engine failure. And throughout pilot certification, what do we do on every certification level? Oh, this is a simulated engine failure. Do we give them, this is a simulated flight control malfunction? So the example here is it is a problem and perhaps it's not really being addressed. Okay, one of my favorite slides, those of you who have heard me talk before know I always jump up and down and say, okay, that's all well and good. That's accidents, that's fatal accidents. Accidents in and of themselves are not a good criteria, though, as to how safe the system is or how safe an individual pilot is. Because for every accident, and lack of accidents do not equal safety, because for about every accident, we may have about 600 incidences, 600 loss of control incidences for every accident that is out there. The more important color here is blue. The unreported occurrences. Every time that it's, oh my goodness, I got myself in a really bad way and I'm really lucky I got myself out of that situation, nobody ever knows about it, and we don't address it, and we don't go back for further training to make sure that next time we find ourselves in that situation, we are sure of how we can get out, or better yet, that we have the training and the academic knowledge and the flight training to not even get ourselves in that situation, or at least stop it before it becomes a real problem. Which brings up a very familiar slide. I don't think we can wear this topic out. We're looking at the margin of safety. Once again, we're not saying that pilots are not good pilots, but what we are looking to do is increase that margin of safety against finding yourself in a loss of control in-flight situation. And as we see your margin of safety throughout a flight over time, from pre-flight all the way through approach and landing, does change. And as we know, approach and landing is usually the highest workload and the highest probability of having more workload than the pilot has capabilities. But the point here mostly is the margin of safety throughout a flight to increase or decrease the chances that you will end up in a loss of control situation. Little bit of background. Some academic research that's been conducted over the last 15 years on unexpected events and surprise fits very well into this topic, because if we look at how pilots think and how they're responding to situations, we find that an unexpected event or surprise can alter your thinking, and it does. But the first thing we need to note is surprise is not necessarily some catastrophic event that all of a sudden there's an event and you are out of control. You have lost control of your airplane. That's not how it happens. It usually creeps up on you. It can be subtle. And there are often cues or clues available to the pilot that there is an impending problem. You can watch the hydraulic pressure decrease, and you can start projecting into the future using good situation awareness that, if I'm going to lose my hydraulic system, then that means I'm not going to have this component or this component. And then it's not necessarily a novel event or something that hasn't been seen before, but what happens is we now are in a situation where we take a look at the situation and we may not predict how that might affect us. We don't predict it far enough into the future that now I don't have my hydraulic system and I'm going to be distracted, and my decision making may even become impaired or delayed because I'm focusing on this little, it may be a little situation, it may be a more serious situation, but I'm becoming distracted and it's interrupting my ongoing activities, which, when we look a little bit further, can lead to not paying attention to what we're doing and losing control of the airplane. So that interruption, and there's quite a bit of research out by Ketis Mukes and others on interruptions and distractions and how that affects our performance that leads directly into loss of control. How about the causes of loss of control? Not the pilot side, not the brain side, but what are the environmental or other causes? And we've broken these down into 3 different categories. And by causes, we mean these are precursors. These are items that happen that, if they are remedied or paid attention to appropriately, may never end up in a loss of control or even a near loss of control situation. However, when we analyze the accidents, incidents, and event reports, we always find, and I mean always, not just sometimes, we always find one of these precursors or sometimes multiple precursors. So, for example, environmentally induced, we can look at one of the high-profile accidents that everybody brings up today. The Colgan accident wasn't the first nor the last accident of its type. There's been thousands of near accidents and incidences, and, by the way, unreported events by pilots that were in very, very closely the same situation. But by virtue of either luck, good pilot training, or a combination of both, they did not make the news. They did not make the papers. And we know this because if we take the accidents, and we know there's 600 incidences, and we know there's all these unreported events, and oh, by the way, you go talk to your friends, they're going to tell you, go talk to any of your pilot friends. They're going to have at least one, if not multiple times, where, boy, that was really close. I cannot believe I got myself into that boat. So environmentally induced includes turbulence, clear air turbulence, and a number of other factors. For example, icing. If we're paying attention to the fact that we're accumulating ice on our airframe and we're aware that our stall speed's going to increase and the other anomalies that we might find with the control of the aircraft, we have a heightened awareness of the probability we may get into a stall situation and perhaps a loss of control. On the other hand, my other example, you may have a system anomaly. It might be an autopilot malfunction. If you're going to pre-flight your autopilot, know what to expect and what a valid pre-flight, I shouldn't have said that. When you pre-flight your autopilot, I didn't really say if, did I? Oh. When you pre-flight your autopilot, make sure you know what to expect and what a valid pre-flight looks like. Okay? What is the system supposed to do? What is the pre-flight procedure? So then, once you've pre-flighted your airplane, you can be confident that or your autopilot, you should be confident that it will work. However, I don't know, I don't pre-flight my autopilot, it always works. Now you've engaged your autopilot, it has an anomaly in it, it gets you sideways, you're surprised, brain doesn't work, your ongoing processes are interrupted, and instead of doing what you might have done if you would have expected that situation, we now have this delay process to recovering the airplane from not necessarily a loss of control, maybe just a minor unusual attitude. Okay? So that can also lead to the situation. And then we also have pilot-induced causes. Once again, I've already talked about inattention and distraction. There are a number of items here that could lead or be a precursor to loss of control. However, the number one resulting event leading to loss of control in flight, anybody want to guess what it is? The number one event that leads to loss of control in flight. Base to final, what? Very good, stall, absolutely. So these precursors, we're not paying attention. We've inadvertently gotten ourselves into a stall situation or a stall spin. And you're saying, well, we practice stalls. We learn how to do stalls and recover from stalls. Don't get me started on that topic. BJ will talk about it. But what we have found is we can mitigate this from the very beginning through both skills and knowledge, being aware of the situation, being aware of the threats, and specific targeted training. Because I only have to ask one question. If we're doing our training right and we're doing our pilot certification correctly and we're evaluating pilots and their skills, knowledge, and abilities correctly, then why do we have so many loss of control and flight accidents? So I'd like to turn this over now because I've asked that question, and BJ is going to talk about what can be done.
And as we all know, that we are doing variations of loss of control training. For example, unusual attitude recovery training. Anybody who's been out there doing it is relatively benign, but this is just an excerpt from the PTS as to what's expected and what performance a pilot needs to have. Now, if you take a look at the image in the bottom center, you'll probably agree that if you're doing training properly and legally and safely in non-aerobatic airplanes, you have never seen a situation like you see there. And that's just one example of an excursion of the flight envelope that we're going to talk about in a few minutes. But to just repeat on what Janine's saying is we can't get away and focus too much on recovery. Even though recovery matters, really what our hallmark of training needs to be is on awareness and prevention. And that's something that needs to be continuously emphasized as we go through this discussion. So what is being done? There's a variety of industry groups. We kind of pulled an example from each area of aviation, general aviation, the FITS program, the MBAA training guides in the corporate world, and probably the one that we pulled a couple references out of here is the Upset Recovery Training Aid Revision 2, documents recognizing the fact that loss of control needs to be addressed, it needs to have improved training, and taking efforts to do so. So if we look into the industry as to who's active in doing this, they're going to try to intervene in this particular threat by applying upset prevention and recovery training. Some working groups going on right now, a hot topic with ICAO. They're now looking at rewriting the MPL. They have a draft version in process to help them with their definition of what upset recovery training needs to be. ICADI is an international committee, advanced training and extended envelopes for the Royal Aeronautical Society, looking in this particular time, this period, looking at loss of control, upset recovery. UPERTA, Upset Prevention Recovery Training Association, International Policing Agency for Upset Recovery to control quality standardization of instructors and program delivery. We saw some statistics from the GAJSC as well, and whether you're aware of it or not, that Congress has mandated that the industry look into solutions for the stall stick pusher and upset recovery regime of training. So there's a lot of activity going on to try to make a difference in this threat that we're seeing. So we need to realize, even though that prevention is important, even though licensing training is excellent, there may be a hole we need to be aware of to make sure that we're tapping it and we're trying to take advantage of the resources we have today that are readily available to make a difference. So there's some examples of out there people doing it right now, just a couple, there's many more. Is we talked about the MPL. It's always been a requirement since it was instituted, but the way it works in MPL is it's a one-liner right now in Annex 1 that says upset recovery training will be provided, but there are no details as to what it is. Well, that's about to change. It's going to be defined in great detail as to what's required. Kind of setting a precedent on the airline world, KLM Flight Academy now requires its students to have upset prevention and recovery training before going to the air carrier. Bombardier Leading Edge program have been doing this for a long time, since the late 90s. Right now, they're following an integrated program of online academics, instructor-led, on aircraft, and full flight simulator training as well to give their pilots an added edge and be able to mitigate, prevent, and if necessary, recover from a loss of control event. So let's now go back to our diagram that I had before initially. I just want to put this into perspective because the big question is, if our licensing training is excellent and pilots are excellent, well, what is the problem? Certainly there should not be loss of control. So what I want to talk about now is the upset, because everybody reads upset of loss of control, and I alluded to this in the beginning. Well, the upset definition that is a little bit tough to see up there is that same box I showed earlier, 45 degrees of bank, 25 nose up, and 10 degrees nose down. Now let's take a look at the limits of licensing training, at least legal licensing training in a non-aerobatic airplane. We now expand that envelope out to 60 degrees of bank and 30 degrees of pitch. That is typically where you see training occurring, because to go outside of those parameters, number one, you start needing a parachute, and then it starts getting into potentially the definition of an aerobatic maneuver. So if we are looking at the airplane upset as the definition. In other words, the edge of the blue box where the pilot, like I said before, has to forget whatever else they were doing and now recover the airplane. You can see that there is a certain buffet region around it where they've been exposed to in the past, limited by that licensing parameter that I have up here. The problem is that represents barely over 10% of the all-attitude envelope. So if there's any event that hurdles them outside of that region into the red region, then it can become a very severe situation. And that's nearly 90% of the all-attitude envelope is unaddressed through licensing training. So does that mean we have to change all of our training to spend 90% of the time dealing with that area? Absolutely not. That's not the point. The point is that if a pilot gets hurtled out into that region, it'd be one thing if their skills were transferable. The problem is they go out into that region, what they typically do day in, day out can often make the situation worse, not better. So what is changing? What's the big deal? What we see here is just one example, and there's many of them that I bulleted, but here's just an example. I have a pilot-induced oscillation. In other words, a pilot overreacting to some type of a situation. Or, for example, it could be a wake turbulence encounter. Whatever is occurring, this is just a situation where the pilot has a 2-second delayed response. In other words, that fight or flight mechanism flew off. They freeze. They're trying to integrate what's going on, and they encounter a rolling vortice in this particular of about 40 degrees per second for about 2 seconds. Now, research has exposed that in light general aviation, that the magnitude of the roll rate imparted by a vortice can be anywhere from 80 to 200 degrees per second. So, of course, clearly awareness, recognition, and good decision-making should keep the pilot out of there. The problem is that what happens when it does happen? Because statistics show that despite our best efforts, we can get thrown out of that region. So the big deal is for pilots is that things start changing. It's exiting their experience, what they've experienced in the past. Their skills are now unreliable and may or may not be transferable. Their cueing is unfamiliar. Now they're having a combination of aerodynamic cueing, motion cueing, audio cueing, buffeting, a variety of things going on that they've maybe never seen cascading simultaneously before that creates an impairment, both psychologically and physiologically in the pilot. So it's essentially a snowballing effect, making the situation worse. So let's now take a look at that graph I showed earlier. I want to show you a couple parameters. I know we're a little bit behind and I don't want to rush. Is that we often think that when we're trying to be safe in relation to the flight envelope, as long as we stay above the stall warning cue, we should be fine. And generally speaking, that is correct. But if you think about your daily operations flying point A to point B, is you spend most of your time actually flying in the normal flight region, in the non-slow flight region of your airplane. And that LRD max Q that I have there is essentially a flight condition where as we start getting below it, the handling characteristics of the airplane start to alter slightly, and we're getting into the region known as slow flight. As we start getting into slow flight and proceed towards the stall, we have a required certification to give us a warning we're going that direction for the pilot to be aware and take preventative action to avoid the threatening situation. The problem is that time and again through real life statistics is pilots don't stop there. Either they don't respond properly or they ignore the cueing because of all the other distractions going on when it occurs. The challenge now, of course, is when they exceed and they go beyond critical angle of attack, the physics of flight change. And what I mean by that is if you think about your time in licensing, I'm not talking about aerobatic pilots, I'm not talking about pilots who spend a lot of time in this region, but if you're the general pilot who has had excellent licensing training, if you think about it, going to the full stall break might be only done when you're doing your initial pilot rating. After that, as you're a commercial pilot, maybe as an instructor you see it, but as a commercial pilot, an ATP pilot, certainly as you get into the big airlines, your goal is to never go beyond the stall warning or the preventative indication. The problem is that's wonderful, except that it does happen, that people do go beyond that. Just like in our previous slides, what's the big deal? Well, again, now they're starting to exit the licensing region, what they're exposed to. Skills are again unreliable. Cueing, the combination of all the cues again, distracting them, and then the impairment occurs. And probably the biggest thing, especially in the stall, and we're going to watch a video on this in just a second, is that the handling characteristics of the airplane are not at all the same in this region. In the red region to the right of CL max or critical angle of attack are very, very different than a normal flight. Again, adding to the confusion, to the impairment, and again, the cascading effect of making it more difficult for the pilot to recover. So, We're unique in the fact that with our business, we've trained thousands and thousands and thousands of pilots. So what if thousands of pilots revealed to us in upset prevention and recovery training? Unknown to most pilots in the world that it really doesn't matter from what we've seen how many flight hours they have, how many ratings they have, what their instructor experience is, their airplane type, or their depth of classical aerodynamic knowledge or academic knowledge. We have found by looking at it, because we expected there to be a difference, when it actually gets into a developed upset, beyond as it exits that licensing region, the envelope, it becomes a level playing field. For people who haven't had specialized training, just about everybody's the same when it comes down to it in their capability. And that is near nil capability in actually affecting recovery from a certain threshold. And again, when I'm saying that, I'm not saying that there isn't excellent licensing training. The problem is when that doesn't stop it, then there's no additional layered defense beyond that. The capability of a pilot to recover often is by accident more than on purpose. Let's watch this video of a typical commercial jet pilot being surprised to the cross-controlled stall.
We're going to do a little scenario here, all right? We'll do a little scenario here. And let's assume we're in your airplane, all right? Do you have any pilots you like to fly with, by the way? Yeah. Let's say, are some of them less experienced than you? Oh, yeah, yeah. Yeah, okay. Well, let's say you've taken one of them flying with you, all right? And he's flying the airplane, all right? But you're pilot in command, of course. It's your airplane. And you guys are on approach. You guys are on approach. And here we are. We're turning base to final. You look off to the left over there, and you see it looks like we're going to overshoot. And then whammo, this happens. What would you do? Recover. Push. Power. Pull. Control. Yeah, control. All right. Wow. How much altitude did we just lose? Well, we lost a whole lot, didn't we? We were almost a launch there. Yeah, 2,500 feet. And, of course, we were how high above the ground? Maybe turning base to final? Maybe 500 to 700 feet, maybe? Yeah, so we didn't survive too well on that one, did we? No. Yeah, all right. Well, we'll talk about that when we get back, all right?
All right, so typical pilot going through just simply a situation where he was kind of lulled into feeling comfortable. The conversation by the instructor was to create an unexpected event. And then in this particular situation of the skidded turn traffic pattern stall, through prevention, recognition, and avoidance, if the pilot knew what to look for, he could have interrupted that judgment chain on the way to that situation. But he did not, ended up into an overbank situation, and it's hard to tell in the video, but he essentially did a split S by pulling through down towards the ground. So instead of doing a rolling recovery, did a pulling recovery, and through research, testing over 100 pilots in a couple months, we found that 75 to 90% of pilots will do exactly that in a surprising event without training. So it's pretty revealing to realize that threshold is real and it's a big threat to pilots. All right, so what can be done? Well, we need to develop a gross mitigation. There's things that can be done in a relatively short period of time that can make a big difference for pilots, and really kind of depends on what type of flying they're doing. It can be academic, it could be just simply on aircraft, or it might be an integrated program of integrating full flight simulator. The bottom line is that something can be happened very, very quickly to make a big difference that can last a career in a pilot. So what does that footprint look like? Well, there's an example of an upset prevention and recovery training program. Classically speaking, what we generally deal with right now is academic training, some awareness training, and then prevention, taking early effective actions either at the edge of the blue region or as we start getting into the white region of licensing training. What upset prevention and recovery training does, it takes it even further. It builds on what's happening now. It reinforces prevention and develops a recovery capability in an all-attitude environment. The most important part of this added mitigation is to be sure that it's not negative training. It's very important that the skills that are imparted in training are transferable and useful, even if that pilot's going to go into a career flying business jets or airline category airplane. So you have to be very, very careful of that. And I'm rushing past this slide just because I know we're running out of time. So if you want to think about it, upset prevention and recovery, that top box is generally prevention, and the bottom box is generally recovery, where CRM and SRM can permeate throughout the entire footprint. Do we have time for this video, Judy? Okay. So here's an example of awareness training. If we just learned from Janine that 50% of loss of control accidents are due to the stall, well, why would a pilot stay in that region? Let's just take a look at an exercise called the falling leaf exercise. And this is where the instructor is going to talk about the essentially the cues and indications of the pilot that they're putting themselves into harm's way. And you'll hear the instructor say, is we're not here to learn skills, we're learning to hear awareness. So the intent of the falling leaf is not to learn how to fly an airplane beyond critical angle of attack. It's to recognize the cues and understand that they need to be not there in the first place and exit the region. So let's watch the video, and then Janine will be up.
Or then you have the controls. I have the controls. Let's go powered idle. Powered idle. So I'm going to talk you through this. Just listen to my inputs, all right? We're going to hold the elevator back. I'm going to help you do that because you're not going to want to do it. Okay. But again, we're not here to develop skills. We're here to witness the instability of stalled flight, okay? All right. All right, so let's go ahead and hold that elevator back. There you go. All right, that's it. Don't let, when the wing drops, just stop with a little bit of rudder. As soon as it stops, get those rudders neutral. You can see it really wants to go on you, doesn't it? Yes, it does. Okay, would you agree that this is pretty unstable? It's completely unstable. All right, now what I want you to do is going to be one step, and it's going to be the push step, all right? Okay. And now push. That's it, one step. All right. And I have the controls. You have the control. So you would have to agree that if we get into a stall, we are fighting instability, all right? We really are. And what's creating it is we as the pilot have eliminated our margin of safety from the stall by pulling on the elevator. Okay. So if there's only one thing we remember from this program in a stall is
To finish what he was going to say is the only thing remember this program in a stall is to push early and correctly to either prevent the stall or recover it in the early stages. Then we can eliminate the threat of the future or the follow-on threat, which becomes the stall spin. And as we get into bigger airplanes, especially beyond the normal category airplanes where we're not in an aerobatic airplane anymore, we now very quickly can eliminate the margin of safety. So I'm going to let Janine come up here to finish things up.
Great examples, BJ. And we just want to make sure that we go through the process and the whole idea of prevention, awareness, prevention, and if necessary, recovery. And hopefully it won't be necessary, but if we go through prevention, one way to do that is to use the classic PAVE model and to be aware of yourself. If you remember the causes of loss of control, the environmental factors, the system factors, and correlate these to the risk elements, you can look at the pilot, not only your ability to fly, but your training, the training that you've had, aircraft system anomalies as far as pre-flighting and knowing your aircraft, being able to predict and perceive the weather and the environment properly, and also take a look at external pressures. If any of you were here this morning for Evan Burns' talk, many times he was talking about maneuvering flight and loss of control in flight. However, the external pressures and the thoughts that the pilots had and the purposes for getting themselves into the situation to begin with were not valid. So being able to deal with those external pressures and evaluate them. And as we've talked about in the past over and over again, we talk about single pilot resource management, being aware of your environment and using all of the available resources. Crew resource management, of course, there's specific crew resource management training necessary for upset prevention and recovery training. And research has demonstrated over and over again that these need to be practiced in the simulator and or in an aircraft and specific to the upset situation. But one of the most important factors that we can look at for prevention of loss of control in flight and recognize it is, once again, aeronautical decision making and looking at the risk factors. And I'm going to throw in my favorite word, metacognition, and I won't take up much more time once you hear this. Metacognition is thinking about what you're thinking about. Are you paying attention to what needs to be paid attention to? And we use the adage all the time to aviate first, to pay attention to the airplane. Aircraft state, the state of the aircraft, where it is a major factor in loss of control. In other words, the lack of awareness of the state of the aircraft is unknown. I mean, the pilot just is not aware of his aircraft state, therefore he's not going to reduce the angle of attack at the appropriate time or early enough. So metacognition, you need to pay attention to what you're paying attention to. And the second part of that is evaluating your own performance. Are you doing what's necessary to control the aircraft and keep it where it needs to be? The last item here, we'll bring BJ back up, and he's going to talk about if you don't pay attention, if you get yourself outside of the normal envelope, then you need to be able to recover.
So I just got finished telling you that prevention is the most important point until you have to recover. Then, of course, that becomes very important at that point. So what I wanted to do now is, this is kind of summary. I just pulled it from our previous chart on proportional counter response. That simply means that whatever event is being presented to you, you need to respond in proportion to it. In other words, you don't want to under-respond, you don't want to over-respond, you have to be able to mitigate and resolve it back into the heart of the blue box we talked about earlier. So let's take a look at an example of a video of a situation of a recovery. This is going to be an overbank nose-low recovery. The particular pilot, you're going to hear him talking through the recovery, ability to break through that crisis, that mental lockup, that incapacitation that he has to affect recovery by solving parameters in a certain process or certain sequence. And then what we're going to do is take a look at transfer control into the airline environment. So running through this quickly, I want to let the videos play because I think there's value.
Nose low, disconnect, push, power, rudder, roll, one. UI attitude, power's coming up.
Okay, so that's an example of training. Now, it wouldn't really mean a whole lot, especially if we're in a situation where we're trying to train airline pilots. The biggest objection that very often happens is, how can I possibly learn anything in a tiny little aerobatic airplane that I can use in a big airplane? Whether that be a light multi-engine airplane, a business jet airplane, or a transport category airplane, well, that statement actually has a lot of validity because there's a tremendous amount of negative things you can train in a light aerobatic airplane for the business jet transport category pilot. However, if that training platform, the aerobatic airplane, is used to develop strategy and concept, then you can actually transfer a tremendous amount of information to help the pilot be more effective. So here's a pilot in a very similar situation, overbank nose low in a 737. I'm going to go ahead and just let it run. Now, is it a perfect recovery? No, it isn't. Is it a safe recovery? Possibly. It certainly beats hitting the ground, that's for sure. So if I can't, up here, you take a look. Here's the speed tape along the left side. Here's the altitude. You're going to see the speed tape enclose on itself. G loading is down over here. Throttle's control column. This is an external view, and then this is in the cockpit. I'm just going to let it run, and you'll see very similar transfer of concept and strategy into this particular situation. So I'll bring Janine up here to talk about it. I know we just have a couple minutes left. I'll let her wrap it up.
Okay, stay up here with me, BJ, because the question was, who needs upset prevention and recovery training? Why not you? What part of this doesn't apply to you? I don't think any part of it does not apply. And however, if you are going to, now I've got you convinced. I think I want to go out and get some of this training. And I'm going to put right up here, buyer beware. One of the problems we have in mitigating this loss of control problem is that there are no licensing standards for the instructors that teach this right now. There are proposed for ICAO licensing standards. So if you are going to go investigate upset prevention and recovery training, be very, very careful who you choose to fly with and who you choose to go to. This is not aerobatic training. They are two different things. That's not to say that aerobatic pilots, airshow pilots and whatever can do a very good job of training this. However, there's a lot more to it than aerobatic, or it's different. I should not say a lot more to it, but it's different than aerobatic training. So be very, very careful. Everybody looks great online. Get references, referrals, and make sure you know who you're working with. Make sure the instructors are qualified, Master CFI. And aerobatics is probably a good place. And some of the resources you might use is the FAA safety briefing. You can pick up a copy out here in the foyer, and there is an article in there that has some more references for loss of control in flight and for choosing a provider for this type of training. The last item I'd like to remind you of is the FAA safety stand down this year is also focusing on loss of control in flight, and it will be presented here for the first time on Saturday. Then it will be presented around the country, and you might find it at your own home airport. So, BJ, anything to add to that?
I think the biggest point to make in upset recovery training, and I mentioned it a few times, is that we can't think that there's anything wrong with the pilots. It's not personal. It's not the pilot. It's simply training. And that's what we're talking about. Giving the exposure, the been there, seen that value, and a method of getting out of it goes a long way towards helping resolve this. And that's one of the biggest things we should consider, is as an industry, is there something that we can do to add another layer of defense to the pilot to help him be safer and get home that same day?
Great. Thank you very much. We've appreciated the opportunity.
Thank you.